Men Only, a podcast for men, about men, what do men want to talk about? In this episode of Men Only, we will discuss why 751,000 men each year are reported as victims of domestic abuse. To find out more, let's hear what men have to say. I'd like to introduce Fergus and Jared, who are contributing to the first episode of Men Only, a podcast that is dedicated for men. Fergus, can you perhaps tell me something about your organisation?
Yep, so I work with AMIS, or Abused Men in Scotland, and we work to support male victims of domestic abuse all the way across Scotland. So we operate a telephone helpline and an email support system that victims can reach out to anonymously if needed.
Right. Jared, perhaps you can give us some of your background as well?
Sure. So I'm Jared Whittaker. I'm an author. I write books around domestic abuse against men, and I campaign for men's rights awareness.
And you were also a sort of domestic abuse victim as well?
Yeah, so that's how I got into it. I was a victim for 14 years, and there's not a lot of resources out there for men, so I'm just trying to contribute to that.
The whole point of this little podcast is really to try and make men understand exactly what is domestic abuse, because I think there's always the assumption that it's physical violence. Perhaps we could sort of talk about why men don't recognise that they're victims. Fergus, would you say when men phone in, is there a confusion there about why they are, what the situation is for them? Yeah,
definitely. So we get people calling up all the time and saying, I'm not a victim of domestic abuse, and then they'll list off, 3-4 incidents of quite extreme abuse, and I feel like it's just very hard for them to see themselves as a victim of domestic abuse, really.
Do you think that's because they're men and they've been brought up not to think of themselves as victims of, from a female?
I think there's a bit of that, and there's a bit of it's just the way we see domestic abuse as kind of a female only problem, really, and that plays into it massively as well, in my opinion. Yeah.
Jared, you sort of said that obviously you were in a toxic relationship for 14 years. I want to actually talk about something that you mentioned quite a lot in the 3 books you've written. You've been very precise and concise as to signals, I think you call them sort of techniques and tools that the abuser uses. When if you don't mind me asking, when you originally met your abusive partner, there's something that I found quite intriguing. You'd call it love bombing. Can you perhaps give us a wee bit more about that?
Yeah, so love bombing is basically when someone just throws everything at you. They bomb you with love, well, obviously hence the name. So they're super affectionate. They'll buy you lots of presents. They'll be all, saying the sweetest things. But it's not just you. Even when they meet your family and your friends, they'll really turn it on. Right. And everyone kind of loves them very quickly. And what generally tends to happen then when you get love bombed is the relationship moves very, very quickly.
Right.
So you end up moving in together quickly. I mean, we moved in together within 2 months of knowing each other. So it's really like a tactic to gain your trust and gain your affection faster than you usually would in a normal relationship or in a normal situation.
Yeah.
So it's just, but I mean, again, it's just one of the tools they use.
Yeah. See, you were saying that within that 2 months, that's a comparatively short space of time to move in with someone. How long is that sustained? Would you say? I mean, I know you've spoken. Yeah.
So I mean, obviously it depends. It varies relationship to relationship. So the way the tools and techniques work is each one is designed to draw you in a little bit, and it's until they know that they've got the next level of power over you. So the love bombing will start to fall away as the others come in, and they know they've got that control over you. Right. It's there's no time frame on it. It's just down to when they know that they've got you hooked.
Yeah, Fergus, when you speak to men, do they refer to the start of relationships as much like what Jared is discussing here? That they thought it was the love of their life?
Yeah, they do talk about that, and that's quite often a reason why people won't want to leave as well, because they still love the person and they still think they can change, or there's still kind of that hope in the back of their mind. So yeah, very much so.
Is that something that comes up quite regularly?
Quite often, yeah. Well, because of the nature of the work that we do, we often speak to people at the end of the relationship or when it's all starting to break down. Yeah. So we do get, like, they love the person and that quite often. We also get, you know, there's a lot of hatred as well between the two partners, and they make life, you know, as hard as it possibly can be for the victim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something, I'm just going to go through quite a lot of what you've written about, Jared. I think that probably the next step would be isolation, where you're isolated from your family and friends. How quick or how gradual is that process? And how do they do it?
Yeah, it's gradual, because you can't just, you know, I always say this to people, like, you don't go on a first date with someone and they punch you in the face, right? Because you'll never go on a second. You'll never go on a second date with them, right? So everything in the beginning is kind of gradual, and like I said, it's gradual, built up to the point where they know it doesn't have to be gradual anymore. So with isolation, you know, they don't want you having family and friends around, and that's purely because they don't want you having people that you can talk to, people that would support you, people that you could tell their bad behavior to, or give, you know, different viewpoints on things. So, but it's not just, you know, you start dating them, they go, well, you're not allowed to see your friends and family anymore because you're not going to really stand for that. So in my case, if I give that example, it was very much like always positioned in a way that it was for my best interest. So like, oh, you shouldn't drive to work with your friend because you really need that time for you mentally. You know, your mental health will suffer if you don't have a bit of alone time. So it was always done like that. And then over time, it just gets more and more forceful, to the point that we never saw my family on special occasions like Christmas or Easter or whatever. You know, it was always her family. I stopped seeing my friends completely. And come the end of the relationship, you know, I had no one.
Right.
Like literally no one.
You talk about also there's a sort of fear factor. And going back to what you were saying about the love bombing, where the abuser will become friends with your family and your friends, do you think, is the fear factor part of what they might say to your family and friends because they now know them and they might say something negative about you?
Well, they do. They do anyway. So they do what's called preempting.
Yeah.
So let's say, I mean, there's actual examples, but let's say they attack you and something happens, and then they'll go and they'll jump on the phone to your friends or family and be like, oh my God, you're not going to believe what just happened. He attacked me and he did this. So if you now go to your friends or family and say, oh, you're not going to believe what happened, she attacked me, they'll be like, oh, you're lying because she's already told us you attacked her. And I think, you know, as society and the stigma, we're more likely to believe a woman in these situations. So there is a lot of that happens, that they preempt what you do. So by the time you're getting out of the relationship, they've already smeared your name to everyone anyway. It just gets worse after you get out of the relationship.
Do you find that you've heard this as well, Fergus?
Yeah, definitely. We'll hear it quite often with false allegations. You know, when the penny drops and they know that their partner's going to leave, they'll throw everything out there. You know, they'll change the situation, turn it on its head so that they're the victim and their partner's the perpetrator, and then they'll, you know, go to the police, and who are the police going to believe? The 5'5" woman or the
6 foot odd guy? Because I noticed, Gerard, in your second book, it was interviews with, it was a dozen men, and you put in their height and their weight, and if you were to see these guys, you would automatically assume, just like what you're saying, there's this presumption the physicality of men actually goes against them. Would you say that's right?
Well, I mean, I remember when I got had the police come round and I said I'm the victim. I mean, they laughed. The guy literally laughed in my face and said, "Come on, mate! Like you can't be serious." Because obviously, size-wise, I'm very big and she's not. So size, I think, size makes absolutely no difference to an abuser. Like plays no part in abuse. But obviously, the visuals with like the police or the court or something does make a big difference.
Do you think it's because organisations or people looking in assume they forget to say that abuse is really about control? It's not necessarily about physical violence.
And I think that's a big problem, is that people think abuse is just about hitting or violence. It's so much more than that. You know, and I don't think people really get, like court staff or police or whatever, really get educated on the nuances of what abuse really is.
Because you obviously, in your first book, you sort of say, why didn't they just leave? There's a title and other ignorant sort of sayings. And it does come back down to this lack of understanding as to what abuse actually is. And it's not just the physical, it is the mental and the sort of control techniques that they use. What I found particularly interesting when you talked about triangulation, could you perhaps explain a bit about that, Jared?
Yeah. So triangulation's when an abuser will introduce a third party somehow into the relationship, and not in that way. But they'll say often it's the evil ex. So they'll say there's an evil ex, like, oh, my ex was so terrible, she did all these terrible things to me, and that serves a double purpose. A, they get sympathy from their new partner, because their new partner's like, oh, your ex is terrible. But also, if they do something that the new partner is unhappy with, they can go, oh, I'm sorry, but it was because of the way my ex treated me. It left me a little bit traumatized, or whatever. It's a good excuse. The other way they do it is they introduce rivals. So, it might be, oh, I was at the gym earlier and there's a really handsome guy that works out of the gym and I really like him. Why can't you be more like him? And it introduces this rivalry. So it forces you to change to be more how they want. So it can be used either way.
I think I sort of read your personal experience of triangulation. I mean, you were a very successful businessman, and it was as if your partner was constantly undermining you because you weren't earning enough, or you weren't high enough up the corporate food chain. And she used sort of triangulation. The boss was the third party. Oh, he doesn't, rate you, or you're worth more. But really the objective was that because she wanted more money, basically.
Yeah, and it's always some way. It's always, you just get compared the whole time, but it doesn't just have to be about money. It could be, oh, that guy earns more money than you, or oh, you washed the dishes today, but that guy, I know my friend's husband washed the dishes and washed the car today, so you should do. It's
always escalated.
Better than you.
Yeah. Do you get any comments on that, Fergus? Have you ever heard about triangulation or comparisons that are ill thought out?
I'm sure there are. I can't speak from any personal experience, but
yeah. Because when I read about it, I thought that's just so sneaky, to be actually bringing a third person and to bounce that idea off it just in order to manipulate you into doing something.
Yeah.
Something else. Yet again, you talk about trauma bonding, and it's really like the Stockhouse syndrome, where you're empathising with your abuser. Do you think if the term Stockholm syndrome was to be used in relation to male domestic abuse, people would have a better understanding of what it is?
No, would be my personal opinion, and I don't think it's because of the term. I think it's just, as men, what I find from my personal experience and from all the men I interview for books or for my YouTube channel is that most men don't realize they're being abused until they get hit. So all of these concepts we're discussing, triangulation, isolation, trauma bonding, they just don't register in your mind, because why would you know about these things unless you experience it? You wouldn't know. So that so I think that's the education that's needed. Whether we call it trauma bonding or Stockholm syndrome, I think it just doesn't compute, especially to men, that these things are happening.
Yeah. I mean, you also talk about gaslighting as well. It's been a sort of major tool for manipulation. Perhaps you'd care to talk us through a gaslighting example?
Yeah, and that's probably, gaslighting is probably one of the biggest ones, is where your abuser tries to make you question your own mind. And again, it can start off really subtle, things like, oh, you said we were going to go to the shops today, and meanwhile you don't want to go to the shops, but they want to, and they're saying you said it. And you'll be like, I don't remember saying that. Oh, you did. And because it's such a minor thing, you'll be like, oh, okay. But then again, it increases. And to the point where they'll do something horrific and then be like, so a good example is from my second book. The one guy confronted his wife when he found Tinder on her phone and all these messages she'd be sending to men.
Yeah.
And she blew up at him. And then he left, but she deleted all of them. And then when he came back, she was like, I don't know what you're talking about. That never happened. Or you're obviously having an episode or something. And it's just like, then he's sitting there going, oh, well, I must have something wrong with me. I better go see someone. But meanwhile, it's just they're gaslighting you.
See, with all the sort of techniques that we've talked about, it's really just to erode the person's confidence, because someone who has got low self-esteem is much easier to control. Would that be right to make that assumption?
Yeah, it's much easier to control someone who doesn't feel good about themselves, feels that they're not good enough, feels like you're the best that they can get. So it's much easier to break someone down and then control them.
Yeah, I mean, you also talk about financial control as well. I know from your book, you sort of said it's something because she actually had the card, she had she had financial control, and you were borrowing money from, is that a friend in the office? because
Yeah.
you're running out of money. See, when things like that happen and it was quite a regular thing, did your friend ever sort of say to you or ask you if something was wrong at home?
No, in my situation, no. And I think people are scared to talk about, domestic abuse. B, there's this kind of stigma that it can't happen to men and it only happens to women. And I think you don't put two and two together. That's why I try kind of write about the signs to look out for.
Yeah.
Because I think they just think, oh, this person's rubbish with money. They're wasting their money. They don't think that it could be that someone's controlling their finances.
Yeah. But you also mentioned the fact that you would be coming into the office and you'd be injured on a quite a regular basis. And now if that was, say, a woman that was doing that, there would definitely be assumptions made. So how did you manage to pass that off? It couldn't have been regular sports injuries, was it?
Yeah, for me it was regular
sports injuries because you're a big guy.
I played five-a-side football and I hurt myself, in a match, and I hurt this and I broke my ribs and I broke my wrist and I did this and I did that. And it was always, and I do wonder, did people ever think anything, or did they just think, well, this guy's really clumsy or he's, something? But yeah, I mean, the signs are there to look out for. People just don't know to look out for them, I guess.
Right. Fergus, see, when you get phone-ins, is it ever anybody that knows a victim or suspects a victim? They know it could be like a brother or does that come?
Yeah, we get calls from friends and family members of people who they suspect are being abused quite often, and it's just about kind of, I think the main goal for us is to try and get the person to reach out themselves,
right?
Because there's only so much kind of support you can give to someone's friend and family member that's going to improve that situation. It has to be that person, first of all, knowing that they're being a victim of domestic abuse and then wanting support and then reaching out for it. So
what's the main questions that people ask if they're phoning up and they're trying to help somebody? Have they actually said to somebody, are you being abused, or are they trying to figure out the best way to approach it?
I think it's a bit of both, It can be really, really difficult for people to ask their friends and family members if they're a victim of domestic abuse, but I feel like it's the same kind of story for a lot of different things, for like suicide, things like that. You just need to be blunt and just ask the person, is this going on? And it's not any like disrespect to the other person. It's showing that you care about them. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of way that people need to view it, and just ask,
Jared, I'm actually just going to get back to some of the techniques. You mentioned something called the sledgehammer in your books, and it was like your personal story where it was your mother that was seriously ill, and your abuser knew that to use the sledgehammer, which is at a point in time, if I understood it correctly, was at your lowest ebb and that you won't walk away. Do you want to tell us about that story?
Yeah, so I mean, sledgehammer to me is like it's the big blow. Obviously they're using their tools and techniques that they've got, but the sledgehammer is like a really massive one. And in that case, it was my mother had a stroke and she was unconscious basically for a week, and she knew that I wanted to talk to my mother about certain things, and she said to me, "Well, I hope your mother dies before you ever get a chance to talk to her, and then you're going to get stuck with that regret." And she knew at the point she said it that I was so under her control that there was nothing. I mean, obviously I was upset about it, and I told her I was upset about it. And literally, I think the day or next day after my mother did pass away, and I never got to talk to her. And then when I brought that back up, then she just started going gaslighting. I never said that. Oh, what are you talking about? I never said that. But she definitely did say it. We had multiple conversations after the fact about her saying it, but then it was easier just to say, "Oh, you're crazy," and imagined it.
Going back to it, where I was speaking to Fergus, was at that point did you decide to leave? At what point did you decide to leave?
No, in my case, I was so heavily kind of hooked in that I wanted to leave. That it was probably more than a year after that, actually, that I did leave. I think nearly 2 years after that, actually. I wanted to leave. I was actually about a week prior to me leaving, and I'll touch on the leaving, why I'm doing this, is I was contemplating suicide, thinking, but not just thinking, oh, maybe I should, like thinking, how am I going to do it? How's it going to work? What do I have to leave behind? What kind of, do I need to leave a note? Do I not? What do I do about it? And I ended up almost not leaving so much as getting lucky. And there's a lot of air quotes going on here
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
she attacked me badly and spent about 30, 40 minutes hitting me, chasing me around the house, attacking me. And at that point, about 40 minutes into that, I just thought, enough, I literally cannot do this anymore. And I said to her, I can't do this anymore. I'm calling the police. And I went to go and get my phone. And as I went to go and get my phone, she grabbed her phone and went, help, police, he's attacking me. He's gone crazy. Oh, he's got mental health issues. Come and save me. And the police came, obviously took one look at me, took one look at her and arrested me. And it was after that point, everything then happened. It's a long story, but I kind of had one of my biggest fears was getting arrested and,
Right.
everything being blamed on me. It happened. And they realized eventually that it wasn't me and let me go and dropped all the charges. And then I realized, well, I don't have to be scared of that anymore. I just never went back.
Right. Obviously, that was quite a traumatic situation, and to get to that point where the police are involved, and that was clearly a big fear for a lot of men as well, because they know they're not going to be believed. Was there ever anybody in your family or your friends that actually approached you or indicated anything that you thought you might need help? Did anybody approach you?
No, I approached someone in my
Right.
family and
Right.
spoke to them about it and told them everything that was happening, literally everything. But the problem is she was so good at her job of being an abuser that she had already been in their ear telling them all these other stories about how it was me, not her. And they literally got to the point where one of the ignorant statements that I put in the first book is that you're just both as bad as each other. And that's what they said to me. And I remember them saying to me, oh, you're both as bad as each other. You're both just terrible people. I don't want any part of this. And so even though I'd opened up fully and told them everything, they just didn't kind of believe it or didn't want to believe everything, didn't want to believe it was her, not me, whatever the case was. Now that I'm out and I've been out years and years and years, now they can see, and I've showed them everything again. Now they can see, okay, it was true. What's quite hard for me personally is not once have they come to me and said, you know what, I'm sorry. Sorry that I didn't believe you. I'm sorry that I said those things. I don't blame them because obviously that's how skillful, abusers and narcissists are. I don't blame them, but at the same token, it would be nice just for oh, I'm sorry that happened.
Fergus, how do you sort of feel about the level of knowledge out there on male domestic abuse?
I think there's still a long way to go.
Right.
Really, I think it's such a difficult thing for people to talk about and to open up about, and cases like Jared's are, I think, really way more common than people assume.
Yeah.
And yeah, just the level of support. There's so much further to go with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I was looking at the stats. It said that 29% of men report domestic abuse in relation to 49% of women, but 70% of men would not call a helpline unless it was anonymous. I think that's quite telling in itself. Obviously, your experience at AMIS must reflect that quite a bit.
Yeah. So, what we know from kind of the statistics on like how seriously it's taken is we have around 10 to 12,000 male victims each year, and that's incidents that have been reported to the police, and the police have come out. And from that, if you look at convictions, only 4% of convictions are involving a male victim. So you go from 1 in 5 victims that they're going out to is going to be a guy, and
Right.
then 1 in 25 convictions. So
Right.
it kind of falls on its face as soon as they report it, really, for the majority of cases,
Right.
There's no way that there should be that big a discrepancy in the number of male victims and then the number of actual convictions,
I mean, this is obviously nothing new. I mean, Erin Pitsey was speaking about, she set up the first female domestic abuse centre, but she also went on to do some research which indicated that women were just as equally as violent as men. And that was decades ago. And if you, Jared, were sort of saying, when I've sort of like was asking you about the stats, we're saying, really, if you consider those stats as being underreported, you're talking about 1 million men. So with 1 million men being abused, why do you think it's so underreported?
I think it's it's everything. It's a perfect melting pot of a society to make it underreported. Men don't want to come forward because of pride, humiliation, embarrassment, etc.
Right.
And I was the same. I was really embarrassed and humiliated. I'm not now because I realize I don't have to be.
Absolutely.
But you are. There's so many stories out there like me saying, police had just laughed at me when I told them. So guys also know that, people aren't going to take them seriously. Police don't take you seriously. Courts don't take you seriously. Family courts, it's a whole nother discussion. But I mean, if you think about it, if you were to go on the streets of Glasgow and stop people coming past, right? Let's say you stop 100 people and you say to them, tell me the top 3, name 3 women's, organizations that deal with domestic abuse. People will probably go, Women's Aid, Refuge, Respect, they'll know them. Now name 3 men's organizations.
Right.
And even though there are some organizations, nowhere near as many as women's, I don't think many people know as much about them. So that's the other problem guys have is, who do you talk to? Who do you go to? Where do you report the stuff, or who do you get help from?
You talk, Jared, about, and you say 2 things I think that sort of struck me about when men decide to get out of a relationship, but to do it safely, and also to recognise what your abuser's like, and not so much to pander to them, but to be safe and to know what the triggers are to be as safe as possible. When you're talking about collecting evidence, what evidence do you want them to record? What do you want them to do that would help in the courts or to convince the police, for example? What do you collect?
I think there's a couple of points to say on there. I mean, you want to collect anything. I mean, it can literally just be a logbook where you've written everything down of like date, time, things like that. That's not going to hold much weight at all in court, but it does show at least that there's been some, consistent thought about this. I mean, unfortunately, like what I had with my court appearances was, he'd obviously been planning this for years, and I was accused of being like some super high level evil genius that had been planning all these things for years. But any videos, any pictures of bruises, any text message exchanges where they swearing at you and telling you all these things they're going to do to you or how they feel about you. So anything like that. I will say that unfortunately, even with that, court's going to be a bumpy ride, and even with the evidence, because the problem is most of these actually end up going through family courts and less so criminal courts, and family courts much less evidentiary based. So it's only when it gets to the very kind of final stages of those court hearings that you can really lean more on the evidence. I went into court with a pack this big of screenshots, pictures, voice recordings, everything under the sun showing 100% she's the abuser, I'm the victim. They wouldn't look at it. In fact, the judge even said to me, this is not an evidentiary hearing. But it was for a non-molestation order. And if a non-molestation order isn't an evidentiary hearing, I don't know what else is.
Yeah. So do you think, obviously there's an educational issue there where people are just not willing to look at evidence when they're presented with it in a court?
I think it's a bias. It starts off as a bias that's in domestic abuse cases, men are perpetrators, women are victims. And that's how that training is done. That's not them being terrible people. That's how they're trained. Mm-hmm. So they're trained, and the training that they're given through the model that's out there in the UK and in the US is everything is worded as in the female is the victim and the male is the perpetrator. So I think there is just this bias. And then obviously there's always this kind of push to believe the victim, but it seems to only really come when the victim is female.
Right.
So it's just really, it's new training needed, more awareness needed, a kind of change. I mean, the big change is the family courts in particular need to go back to this innocent until proven guilty, and evidence needs to matter more.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that it's better for somebody to have legal representation when they're going into family court?
Yes.
Or is it a financial? Obviously, there's the financial aspect. Some people wouldn't be able to afford it.
So that's the thing. If you can afford it and afford it comfortably, yeah, definitely. Because it takes the stress off you. You don't have to prepare the documents yourself. You don't have to represent yourself. You don't have to answer all the questions. Someone can help you through that. It's a very, very stressful thing. But if you think it's going to cost you £10,000, just times it by 4, whatever you think it's going to be. And if you can afford £40,000, go for it. But if you can only afford £10,000, you're not going to cover it. So in my situation, I've years through the court system, and I had a solicitor at first, ran out of money, had to represent myself, saved up, got a solicitor again, ran out of money, and went through that cycle. And the problem is the abusers know this, and with post-separation abuse, what they do is they delay things. They are deliberately they make false accusations. So it drags everything out, and you end up spending more and more and more money to the point that you can't afford a solicitor, which is what they want. Because, when I represent myself at court, the judges might as well just come into the thing and say, you're a man, look what you look like, we don't believe you. Because that's always the case. But, if you have someone, they're more likely to be a bit more impartial, I guess.
Yeah. I think that you sort of actually say in your book about you look like a biker.
Yeah.
And I think that it's always gone back to what things look superficially as opposed to looking at anything in depth. And as I see it, and as what you've very written eloquently about, is the fact that the abuser doesn't want to let you go. So it is not just a case of physically leaving someone, it's the emotional journey you go afterwards where you're trying to extricate yourself from a toxic relationship. I'd also like to know how that impacts if you've got children.
Yeah, look, post-separation abuse is huge. And I think, again, it's another topic that I actually literally put something out about this today on my social media about post-separation abuse, because I think a lot of people think once you're away from your abuser, it's over. But it's not always the case, because they still want that control. So they'll want to control your finances. If you have children, they'll control when you can see your children or not. So there's a lot of stuff that then goes into that afterwards. And a child, if you're talking about a narcissist, because not all abusers are narcissists, but if you're talking about a full-blown narcissist, a child to them is like a pawn in their game. They don't see the child as anything else than like the best piece they have, because it's so easy to control someone with their child. They can threaten you not seeing your kid again. They can make false allegations against you so you lose parental rights. There's so many things like this that can happen. And, I know everything I'm saying sounds super, super negative, but it's kind of whatever I say to guys is it sucks, right? It really, really sucks, and it's going to be hard, but it's worth it to get through it and get the other side. You can get through it. You can speak out. You can move on. It's just hard, and you need to know that up front that it is hard, but it's worth it.
Fergus, do you hear a lot about when people phone up, they're concerned about their children?
Yeah. I think that's probably the number one reason guys don't want to leave. Yeah, is because they don't want to. Well, first of all, they don't want to leave their kid with the abuser. For one, maybe worried about the safety of their child. And they don't want to go to social services because they think that'll be it. The family will be split up. But definitely, it is one of the primary reasons people don't leave is because they don't want their children, and they risk massive financial strain on them trying to go through court and fight for the right to see their kids. We've had clients phone up and say, I've spent just under 10 grand fighting for the right to get to see my kid, and then they're saying, I've got no money left. I'm gonna have to give up. Like, how am I supposed to explain that to my child when they're older? And it's an impossible situation. And
because is there any hostels in Scotland or the UK where men can go to and see their kids? Any safe environments?
I think there's one refuge in Scotland. It's based up in the Highlands. I think it's called COVAS, the organisation that run it. Obviously, it's in the Highlands, so it's not somewhere that like guys from Stirling, Glasgow, Edinburgh are gonna want to go or feel comfortable going. They're gonna have to pick up their whole life and move. And we've had people move down to England to find a refuge, which is...
So what's the situation in the UK-wide with regard to refuges for men?
UK-wide, I think I'll be guessing, there's probably like 10 in the whole of the UK. I know there's one in Scotland. I know there's more in England, but comparatively, to the female refuges, there's basically none. You know,
So what's the sort of ratio like between?
I couldn't honestly tell you
Yeah.
the ratio, but you know, it's few and far between.
Few and far between. Why do you think, after all this time, there isn't enough money being pumped into charities to actually facilitate this?
It's a hard question
Yeah.
to answer. I just don't think it's spoken about nearly enough, especially at the policy level. And we have this kind of weird thing where males are kind of tied into the violence against women and girls policy, and it just doesn't really make sense to have it there. And then it creates a lot more confusion, I think,
Yeah.
in the support for females and the support for men. You know,
Yeah, because I think at the end of the day, abuse is abuse.
yeah.
I mean, it's just like templated. It's the same sort of thing, but it just so happens that it appears to be more unacceptable for men to be perceived as being abused. I was going to talk about Clare's Law. That was somebody who got murdered by her partner, and it gives you the right to actually go and ask if you suspect someone is an abuser. Is that something that can also be used for is there a list of like females in that Clare's Law that are abusers? Do we know that?
No. So it's anyone who has a record.
Right.
So if I was to go and ask, I'm dating so and so, I feel that she may have a history of abuse. Can you check for me? They can check. They're meant to check if it's a man or a woman.
Right.
But obviously, it'll only be if there is a history of abuse, and there's probably less likely to be as many women with a history of abuse because it's not reported as much, it's not recorded as much, not taken as seriously. So the Clare's Law still stands, but you'll probably have less luck with it, I guess.
Right. I'm just trying to think. I watched a sort of series on Netflix, Baby Reindeer, when he goes into the police station, and had he gone there earlier, he would have seen that she had been arrested prior to his experience with her. And I just thought, is it going to become more common that will happen, that there'll be more women registered as abusers? It all depends on whether they're going to get convicted or not.
Yeah. I think it depends on the guys asking as well. I think in terms of the numbers of it's like of the disclosure applications, like from men and women, it's only 4% are for a male at risk.
Right.
So we need a big uptake in guys actually asking about their partner and asking, has this person been an abuser in the past or not,
Because what I've got down here is like, what generally is, I think you've covered this, Jared, basically, what is the experience of men when they contact the police, social services, family law courts, but you have painted quite a grim picture. Do you think that's likely to change if the education is going to be a big part, even from, say, a school level, so that people are aware that, it's something that I think it does boil down to there's bad people out there who will abuse you, and that they can be either male or female.
I think it's a massive change that's needed in just society to change this view that men can't be abused and it's women. So it's more guys speaking out, more documentaries on Channel 5 like that one that came out. More things that people are seeing in the mainstream media. There is also politics involved where there is a lot of funding available for organizations, and I think all funding, 1% of domestic abuse funding goes to men's organizations, 99% to female organizations. So there's obviously politics involved there where there's a lot of money being chased. It's just a huge change where it needs to be shown that, like you said, an abuser and his abuser, doesn't matter if they're a man or a woman, every victim deserves the right to fair treatment, fair trial, fair investigation, etc. So that's the point we have to get to, but I think there's an awful lot of work to get to that point.
I mean, obviously you're doing what you're doing, Jared. You've written 3 very good books that are an easy read, very concise, and actually explain it to the nth degree because you yourself have been a victim. Therefore, it definitely gives it veritas. With regard to that, if you were to start are you going to start a campaign? What's your future tactic to raise the profile of this issue?
So I try and encourage more people to speak up. Obviously, I try to speak about it more. I've launched a campaign called Read the Change campaign, which is about getting people to send books about male domestic violence, whether they're my books or someone else's books, to every police station, every courthouse, every politician they know, to try and get this more out there. I think it needs to go in front of Parliament for an understanding and a change to the approach of things with the way family court works in particular. But it's fighting the societal views that men can't be victims, but also fighting against the people that are trying to perpetrate these views, because there's a lot of, I could name names, but there's a lot of female abuse campaigners out there that if you actually look at the stuff they're putting out there on social media and things like that, it's not campaigning for women, it's campaigning to hate men.
Right.
And it's that has to change as well and be taken less seriously. If a guy was to say something really hateful about women in general, it would be really jumped on and would be treated quite seriously. But I mean, you must see the stuff that's going out there on Twitter every day from some of these female campaigners. It's literally hashtag kill all men, constantly. So that needs to change as well.
I think I have definitely noticed it, but I think it's escalated in the last few years. And I think the problem, that's why I'm doing this programme, is because I feel men need a platform. Because I think the idea of just being masculine has been demonised. And I think the only way to go forward, I think, is to bring men and women back together and not to naturally assume that each is going to be a perpetrator or a predator, rather, of the other. And I think that dialogue has changed. Obviously, there's an awful lot of things in society that's happened, like, for example, the Me Too movement. But yet again, it's that idea, is what you were, Fergus, was saying about false accusations. And that's becoming to the fore now, where a lot of people can just make false accusations, especially in social media, where there's no necessity for evidence. And then everybody piles on to the same, and it's like a single narrative. What do you think that your charity can maybe do, or have you tried to maybe try and ask Holyrood about, extra funding? I know that's a bit ask.
Do our absolute best. Funding is probably the main issue.
Yeah.
I think it's the same for all third sector organisations.
Yeah.
Everybody struggles with their funding, but being like one of the only support organisations for male victims of domestic abuse in Scotland, like we don't really have any other options. Like, we need to be funded, or guys aren't going to get any support really.
I know the third sector can be quite challenging, especially the problem with funding in the third sector, as I see it, is you have to deliver on certain objectives that the funding is tied to. Do you find that an obstacle?
Yes and no. I feel like most of the objectives are good, so it is good to hit them. But I feel like everyone's in the same situation, and it gets to the stage where you're kind of pitting male support against female support, which shouldn't be the way it is.
Case.
No, you know what I mean? Yeah. So we should be trying to support all victims of domestic abuse, no matter their gender or any other indicator of diversity. Everyone should be supported, and it shouldn't be at the expense of male victims or female victims. So I feel like that's one aspect that needs to change. It needs to be set up in a way where, if we're getting more funding, it's not going to be taken away from, a female organisation. So,
or it should be more fairly distributed, or shared resources. Would that be a solution? So if you were to, I'm going to ask you both this, if you were to speak directly to, we've got a new Westminster government at the moment, if you were to say something to them, what would you say to them, Jared?
I think, it's difficult because of who the new government is, but we won't go into politics. But, it's really about equality and fairness. The system is not designed for equality and fairness at the moment. It's designed to, try and show support for women and girls. And like Fergus was saying, that's amazing. That women and girls who get abused must get support and they must get the funding. But it's not designed in any way to support male victims. And, that just has to change. It has to be a case of there's no gender when it comes to this. It's a genderless crime. Treated as abuse is terrible, not as abuse against women is terrible, because all abuse is awful. And until that starts getting treated like that, nothing's going to change.
Yeah. Fergus, what would you say?
I think Jared summed it up
Yeah,
very nicely.
yeah,
there,
I think he did, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is, I think what surprises me once I started to research into this was the numbers involved, and why the numbers involved don't relate to the support that you're clearly not getting at the moment. Because it's exactly this. It doesn't really matter what the gender is. I mean, abuse is abuse. But I think, would there be any benefit in... Has Emma's actually approached like female hostels to sort of that deal with this, to see if they would tie in with you?
As far as I know, no, but they're set up in a way where it's only females can go to these
Right.
organisations, because they're going to have like multiple people in at once, and they can't have them like housed with guys, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it gets quite complicated in terms of that. But we'd love to be able to offer, especially a refuge. We'd love to be able to give somebody, you know, a safe place to come.
Yeah, that'd be great. Do you think that the people that do deal with female abuse victims would be a sort of training aspect where they sort of like become more aware of what happens to men? Would that help?
I think it would. I think it's going to be very difficult to do that, because they're seeing it day in, day out,
From
females being abused by males. So it's probably going to be very rooted in them that, you know, it's a female focused problem. So it's quite difficult to set it up in that kind of way. But we'd definitely be open to it, and we'd be open to do like awareness raising sessions with some female focused organisations, talking through kind of both sides. And I feel like that would be even more useful for, you know, kids, especially, you know, young people who are going into their first relationships. Yeah, I think that.
See, I think that's the problem with, and it's going back to sort of like what society is at the moment, where I think men are being demonised, and I think it is reflected in. There's been a few stories in the papers about, you know, youngsters. It's their first date, they're being falsely accused, and it can destroy their lives at a very early age. But of course, that is another matter. If you were to say one single thing to the men out there, or to the families out there who may be listening to this, what would you say? Would you sort of say, I think I would probably say, I'm going to actually quote you, Jared, from one of your books. This is what I would say to them. Every single thing a narcissist does, no matter how big or small, it is for them, and it is designed to benefit them and them only. You are nothing to them except a means to an end. This is a situation which you cannot be fixed, but you should want to end it. I think that's very true, and I think you should also forgive yourself because you've ended up in a toxic situation. But what would you say, Jared?
Learn everything you can, because the more you learn about it, the more you start realizing how much you can forgive yourself for being where you are, and how much you were controlled. But also learning helps you find a way out, because you understand the steps you can take and things like that. And like I said, I mean, something I say to every guy I talk to is, it is going to be hard. It is stacked against you in a lot of ways. It's not going to be nice. It's not going to be fun. Court's horrific. You know, dealing with police is horrific. Even if, you know, man, woman, no one likes dealing with the police. No one likes going to court. It's stressful. It's not going to be nice. It's not going to be fun, but it is going to be worth it in the end, hopefully.
Fergus, any last words?
I think that covered it really
That really
nicely.
did.
I'd say planning is probably the most important thing from where I see it, is making sure you know what the next step is, and you know who you've got to talk to, or what the plan is really. So yeah, they're gonna throw everything at you. So it's just be ready for it, and have a backup plan to your backup plan. You know. Yeah.
I mean, I think with your books, Jared, you've very, very clearly you've covered that, where it's just like you will need to have a backup plan. You will have to recognise the signs. You will need help. And I think the final thing I think we should have probably mentioned was, Jared, you talk about counselling. Has been really important as well, not just while you're in their relationship, but when you leave after years, because it can take a lot of time, because it is mental abuse, to actually get that person out of your head and to get your get your life back. Although it'll never be the same, but it's quite a long journey, but one that's worth taking. So, gentlemen, I'd just like to thank you both for taking the time to speak to me. And no doubt, I'm hoping we maybe have to come back and I'll speak to you again. I hope this raises awareness. And for anybody out there, I'd say read Jared's books, contact Fergus's charity. There is help out there and you deserve it. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I hope you found the podcast interesting and you'll be wondering why a woman is presenting a podcast specifically for men. Addressing men's issues was the original idea of Gerard Anderson, Jez, my partner. Jez had a lifelong interest and in-depth knowledge of men's issues, and this year he wanted men to have a platform for open discussion and debate, hence the podcast. Jez was diagnosed with prostate cancer over a decade ago, but he never wanted or was defined by it. For Jez, he was first and foremost an artist. Apart from his plans this year to produce a podcast, he aimed to raise his artistic profile by auctioning his latest paintings as NFTs. Jez passed away due to a particularly aggressive form of prostate cancer on the 28th of November 2023. Both the podcast and the auction will go ahead. To fulfil his ambition and my promise to him is the reason why I am presenting this podcast and will auction his paintings now to raise funds for prostate cancer research, in particular stage 4 cancer, and the Glasgow Maggie Centre, who supported us and many other cancer patients and their families. So in memory of Jez, who I know would always prefer to be known as an extremely talented, unique artist, I have the immense pleasure of showcasing his first painting, which will be auctioned. Jez was a great artist, but for me, he was by far a greater, wonderful man whom I had the privilege to share my life with.